course, the reason why we are doing this online this evening rather than our usual meeting location at Mill Creek is, of course, the coronavirus situation, and that's all that dominates the news. It dominates a lot of what's online discussion. There's a lot of uncertainty and conflicting information. And by the way, if you're going out for food, you can't go to a restaurant, but to sit in. But if you're going to do a takeout, we encourage everyone to help support Mill Creek Cattle Company. It's a difficult time for all restaurants in this area. So they've supported us over the years. They meet there, so let's support them. And you can find their website. You can order online. Carol and I have done that for the last 2 Saturdays. You get a great dinner at a very reasonable price. So let's please support them. Every day you can look at the here's on Johns Hopkins University. It shows the number of cases worldwide and in the United States, and the number of fatalities that have been attributed to the coronavirus, and that at this point is going up every day. We also can watch simultaneously the economy going down every day. Just this week, there was another 6.6 million new claims for unemployment insurance, making 10 million in 2 weeks. That's 10 million lost jobs in just 2 weeks. Goldman Sachs is now predicting that the economy will contract by 34% in this quarter, with a loss of 27 million to 66 million jobs. The St. Louis branch of the Federal Reserve is estimating the unemployment could get up to 32%, and that's worse than at the worst of the Great Depression. And you look at this in a little context, try to get some context for this. This was in 2016. According to CDC, 80,000 people died from the flu that year. And just in 2019, through March 21, there were 38 to 54 million cases of flu, 18 to 26 million medical visits, 400,000 to 730,000 hospitalizations for flu, and between 24,000 and 62,000 deaths from flu. But no one urged shutting down the economy. Candace Owens, she got some of the same kind of data, looking at other causes of death. 250,000 from medical errors, accidents, 169,000 a year, alcohol, 35,000, flu, 80,000, fat-induced heart disease, 300,000. But again, the government is not trying to shut everyone down and take away our liberties over these deaths as well. I would just say this: if someone dies of coronavirus, we're not making light of that. If someone dies of regular flu, of a car crash, of stroke, of Alzheimer's, of heart disease, whatever it is, that is a tragedy for that person and for their family and their friends and colleagues. But it's important in making good decisions on this key issue of the economy and the health and the lives of our citizens, that we make good, rational, informed decisions. You see, Sweden has decided to let the virus run its course. And their economy is going to drop 10%, employment is estimated to go up to 10%, even just because of the global economic depression that is beginning. And of course, you have the politics. And Branko is one of my favorite cartoonists. And we see the Democrats' effort to try to exploit this situation to the hilt. And here we see Adam Schiff doing his homework. He's working from home, so here he's busy doing his homework. And of course, the mainstream media knows who to blame for the situation. Now the Democrats are saying, gee, this is so serious, Trump, you didn't take it seriously enough. Well, let's take a look at what they were saying earlier.
The risk to New Yorkers for coronavirus is low, and our city preparedness is high.
This should not stop you from going about your life, should not stop you from going to Chinatown and going out to eat. I'm going to do that today myself.
Come to Chinatown. Here we are. We're, again, careful, safe, and come join us.
There is no concern at this time for coronavirus in our region.
The Department of Sanitation is ready for Mardi Gras 2020.
The facts are reassuring.
We want New Yorkers to go about their daily lives.
But there's really no need to panic and to avoid activities that we always do as New Yorkers. We are a hardy people.
Americans do not need to panic. What I would suggest, however, is that Americans take this as a wake-up call for seasonal flu.
There's very little threat here. This disease, even if you were to get it, basically acts like a common cold or flu.
So we're telling New Yorkers, go about your lives, take the subway, go out, enjoy life, and certainly not to miss the parade next Sunday. I'm going to be there.
If you had to, would you close down the borders?
No.
We need to be honest about the American people, with the American people, about the fact that we can't keep people coming here from China.
And transmission is not that easy. I think there's been a misperception that coronavirus hangs in the air waiting to catch you. No, it takes direct person-to-person contact.
We also know that if it were likely to be transmitted casually, we would be seeing a lot more cases.
Right,
Yeah.
because this is New York and you're in elevators
Exactly,
and trains with
exactly.
everybody all the time.
That was then, this is now. Go back to our PowerPoint.
Oh, look at that old cake. Oh, jeez. I'm with you.
And beware of the Democrats' agenda. As Obama's first chief of staff said, never let a serious crisis go to waste. Just in the last day or two, Gavin Newsom said this is an opportunity for reimagining a more progressive era as it relates to capitalism. And so yes, absolutely, we see this as an opportunity to reshape the way we do business and how we govern. Or Majority Whip Democrat James Clyburn in the House said this is a tremendous opportunity to restructure to fit our vision. And the restrictions that are coming down, this is an article by our Katie Hopkins, who was out here a couple of times recently, how the British police are encouraging people to turn in their neighbors and report them, like the Stasi, secret police of East Germany, if they see them out doing something that they're not supposed to be doing now. And we see the same kinds of things happening in the United States. In fact, for controlling people, coronavirus is much better than climate change. Because everyone is complying. The government says stay in your house, and most people are staying in their house. They're shutting down their businesses, whereas they mostly ignore the hectoring of the climate change activists. So what do we do? Well, fortunately, we have Dr. and Mayor of Loma Linda, Dusty Rigsby. Dusty is a physician with Loma Linda University Medical Center. He's also a professor of medicine there, so he's involved in training and teaching other doctors as well. So we thought we wanted to get his perspective on just how serious coronavirus is, how much of a threat it is. Does he think it warrants the loss of tens of millions of jobs in the Great Depression to try to contain that and save lives? He also went through an election himself in Loma Linda, and he and two of his colleagues on the Loma Linda City Council for election, John Leonard and Ovi Popescu, and they were challenged this time by a well-funded slate of Democrat socialists trying to, because the Democrats have so much money, they're trying to take over local races as well. So he will give us his perspective on that as well. Dusty Rigsby. And remember, text your questions to 951-205-3690 or put them in the comments below this video on Facebook. So we'll give you Dusty Rigsby.
Good evening, Tea Party Patriots. If you were looking for a better looking speaker, you got the wrong choice when you selected me. So we'll go ahead anyway. You'll have to put up with it. I am a physician, I am a politician, and you just saw some videos showing that when politicians tell you what you should do, you should ignore what they say because it's probably wrong. So if you want to ignore me, you can, because the politician side of me would predict that what I'm about to say is not very helpful. But I can tell you with local elections, let's start there because the coronavirus will always be with us. For local elections, what's happening in our state is that the Democrats have total control of the legislature, all of the statewide offices, all of the arms of state government, but they realize they have very little control at the local level and at the county level, and they're correcting that mistake. So what's happening is the Democratic Party and all of their friends in the unions are making a concerted effort to take over the local offices. And these are, by definition, nonpartisan offices. For example, your city councilmen, your mayors, your board of supervisors, none of them run as a Democrat or as a Republican. They run as nonpartisan. But what's happening is the parties are getting involved, and because the Democrat Party is so much more powerful, they're being much more effective in recruiting candidates and funding them using their political arm, otherwise known as the unions. And in my race, there were two left-wing candidates who came forward, young and idealistic, and they used every possible means to get elected, and in the case of Loma Linda, they succeeded in getting one of their members on our city council. So one of our conservative city councilmen was defeated by a leftist. And he used every technique you can use short of personal attacks and going after each one of us individually. He did not do that. But he did everything else. He did everything according to the book. He had full support from the Democrat Party, the local San Bernardino County Central Committee. And most of his funding, however, came from family, friends, and people in his community from around the country. So we can only detect one donor in his reports that was from Loma Linda. So he got most of his funding from outside of the city of Loma Linda, and he went door to door telling everyone essentially that Loma Linda doesn't put in sidewalks and doesn't pave streets. Well, anyone who follows the truth is that Loma Linda has probably the best paved streets in the Inland Empire, certainly better historically than Redlands, and way better than most other communities. We repave all of our streets every 6 years, for example, and other communities let them go for 20 years and just patch the cracks. So if you run a campaign where you basically tell people, I want to do that which government does well because it's not being done well and it's a lie, then you get elected because people believe you. And they also started suggesting that we weren't doing enough for the homeless and that we weren't doing enough to intervene in people's lives. And even after his election, he's putting things on his Facebook page saying that, for example, the city of Loma Linda should pay for everyone in town to get a coronavirus test. And that would be multi-millions of dollars more than the city takes in per year. And it's a classic example of how the government is the answer to everything. And I was at the Lincoln Club for Riverside County, and they told me the sorry story of how the city council of Riverside had 4 leftists elected in the last election, insurgents, and wiped out the conservative majority on the Riverside City Council in one fell swoop. So they're after us. It's kind of an unknown thing that most of the city councilmen in most of the cities in the Inland Empire are conservatives. And you'd never know it from the general electorate that elects them, because conservatives are known to get things done and to do things appropriately. And they're being replaced by people who want to invade your life, who want to spend more money than they're given and raise your taxes. So we all have to remain diligent and make sure that doesn't happen in the future. We need to get involved in some of the things that really pay off, like ballot harvesting, that's currently being done either by the party on the Democrat side or by the union members themselves. And it's an effective approach that defeated one of our conservative city councilmen, Mr. Popescu. So now let's talk about the coronavirus. Anything I tell you about the coronavirus is incomplete, has insufficient scientific backing, and is speculative. Anything anybody else tells you is the same thing, because it's a new disease. Most of the data are coming out of a lying totalitarian regime called Communist China. So physicians are making decisions, and the leaders of all the countries in the free world are making decisions on lockdowns and things like that based on the advice of the Communist Chinese, who have an agenda to take over the world. So it's kind of interesting that if you hear what everybody's basing our reaction to the coronavirus on, it is the supposed fact that the Chinese locked everyone down and the disease disappeared. Well, that disappearance is a total lie, and even the CIA is saying that the things that they said were complete fabrication and that the disease is rampant in China. So the lockdown slowed it down a little bit, but didn't eradicate it by any means. So when you're thinking as a leader of a free country, a total lockdown obliterates the disease. Let's do a lockdown. Well, the problem is that if that was a lie, then you might be doing the wrong thing. So if you look at what happens with a disease like the coronavirus, it spreads by just walking through the air. You breathe it in, and someone who's breathing near you, their breath is somewhere in your vicinity. You breathe it in and you get it. It's highly transmissible. It's not something that you can necessarily avoid by staying 6 feet away. Have you ever noticed that there's a wall around you 6 feet away from you that doesn't allow any wind to blow? Yeah, it's absurd to think that that's the way to be protected. And if you wear a mask, you have some protection from inhalation of droplets that are infected with the coronavirus from your fellow man, but it's not 100%, but it's probably better than nothing. But the disease itself is reported to have a mortality rate ranging from 0.1% to 10%, depending on the jurisdiction. Now, why is there such a difference? Well, it's probably because the ones with a 10% death rate didn't do any testing or very little testing, and they only tested the ones who were horribly ill, and 10% of them died. And then the ones that have 0.1% were testing pretty much everybody and discovered there was a lot of asymptomatic infection. So you can't trust any of these numbers. The other possibility is that there are multiple strains flying around the world, and some of them are killing 10% and others are killing 0.1%, 1/100th as many. Not likely, but remember the history of the Spanish flu from 1918. If you remember that in your childhood, because you're now 120 years old, what happened is there was a mild flu that went around in the spring, and then it mutated, and then there was a deadly flu in the fall that killed half the people infected by it. So one of the problems you have with a lockdown is that if the population is not infected by the mild strain, it is more susceptible to the severe strain that comes later. So one of the things we fear in the medical community is that round 2 could be much more deadly than round 1. So then you have to decide, is the public interest best served by having no one infected with the mild strain? Is flattening the curve helpful in the long run? Can't predict. We don't know. Will there be an extremely deadly version that come in the fall or next year? We don't know. So anytime a politician tells you or a physician tells you with great surety that he knows what's the best thing to do, you can know that it is a fabrication. There is no one who can predict the future. Some people like to read the Bible and say that's the prediction for the future. Well, the Bible doesn't tell us exactly which plague will be the last plague. So it's difficult to pin your hopes on that as well. So, unless you have someone who's really good at predicting the future, a modern day Nostradamus, I would not put a lot of faith in anybody's predictions. The flu itself manifests the coronavirus manifests with a few fairly predictable symptoms. In a lot of people, it's asymptomatic, maybe a few sniffles. In most people that have what's recognized and causes people to be tested, they have a dry cough, they have a fever, a sustained fever that lasts days and up to 2 weeks, and they have a loss of sensation of smell, which is very peculiar and out of proportion to the nasal stuffiness that usually comes with a cold. So if you have predominantly a sore throat and a runny nose and no body aches and no deep cough and no sustained fever, you probably have a cold. If you have a temporary fever that lasts a day or two and then causes backache and things like that and headache, then you probably have the flu. But that's also similar to the COVID virus. So it's difficult to know the difference, and that's why we recommend testing in that circumstance. But if you're not going to do anything different medically, the testing is kind of a waste. And it's more of a thing to find out how many people have it so that the newspapers can flash the latest statistics. It doesn't change the medical management. So we in medicine, we don't do anything different for you based on that result. We tell you to go home, isolate yourself, don't infect your fellow man, and come back out into the light of day after the infection has passed. And if you deteriorate, go to the hospital. And if you do that, then you're doing the best job as a citizen. If everybody floods an emergency room that's infected, then everyone there will get infected and the whole thing will snowball. But remember, the statistics on this are roughly equivalent to the flu. The death rate in societies that do massive amounts of testing is less than 1%, far less than 1%. So are we overreacting? Some of us would think so, because I may be a physician, but I'm also an armchair economist. And I know that if you are, let's say, as a human being, let's say you decide to stop your beating heart for about 3 months and then just restart it at the end of the 3 months because hard times are coming by. The problem with that is you go into brain death, you go into your body rots, and there's nothing to restart. The same thing happens with an economy. If you stop an economy, it's all based on flow. It's based on funds flow. It's based on money flowing from you to someone you're purchasing from them to someone else they're purchasing from trade. And you can't just stop that and then restart it. So we have done the metaphorical equivalent in this country or in this world of committing economic suicide in response to a disease that has a death rate well below 1%. Now, that to me sounds like a bit of an overreaction. And to me, this is a dress rehearsal for when Ebola escapes into the wide world community. This is a dress rehearsal for when the original SARS comes back and starts killing huge percentages of the people infected. That's when you shut down your economy and go into hibernation. But what we have done is such an overreaction, it's almost laughable. And for totalitarian regimes, this is the best thing that has ever happened to them, because people are begging for the government to come in and rescue them from that which the government and sorry to say, the medical community has requested that they do, which is commit economic suicide. When finances go awry, people turn to government, and it is an extremely dangerous thing. So, what do we do? What do we do? We're already down. We're committed to this path. There's not much we can do. We can't do anything as individuals to change it, but we can at least hold people accountable for the decisions that they've made. And interestingly, you listen to those things, and the politicians are all carping at one another about what you do. Like, did Trump mess up? Well, the things he's accused of messing up, everyone else did the same thing. He did it for a shorter time than they did, which was to blow off the pandemic. And you saw the videos of how prominent Democrats were doing exactly the same thing, and for longer than he was. And then you say, did he overreact by clamping everything down? Well, everything was clamping down before that. It was the medical community that said to do this. It was the epidemiologists who said to do this. Did they overreact? Yes, because of bad information from a totalitarian regime. And it would be beyond sad for the result of this epidemic for totalitarianism to be the result of this disease, which was, I believe, overreacted to based on misinformation from a totalitarian regime. But humanity has a way of sinking like a dog returning to its vomit into totalitarianism. So, what do we do in medicine? What do we do for people who are sick with this disease? We try to help them if they descend into respiratory failure. And if you haven't already discovered through your searches through the internet, the medical reason why people die from these viruses is because their immune system wasn't quite fast enough at killing the virus. The viral load became very high, infected a very large percentage of their cells, and their immune system finally rears up and fights back. And the immune system essentially does chemotherapy. It kills cells that are infected by the virus. And in the process of doing that, it releases so many inflammatory mediators that it kills the host. Your own immune system kills you in the final result with this disease. So paradoxically, physicians now are using immune system suppressants to try to save the patients who are dying from respiratory disease, because their own immune system, in its haste to kill the virus-infected cells, kills the patient. So now we have shortages. Hospitals are all trying to find these drugs that are applied because they're only made in quantities sufficient to treat a few patients with autoimmune diseases like rheumatoid arthritis and lupus, and there aren't enough of them to treat millions of people infected, or the tens of thousands that will eventually have respiratory failure. But the saddest thing about the whole thing that I see is that this epidemic could end up killing several tens of thousands of Americans, and the economic collapse that was brought on because of misinformation from the Chinese communists about the success of their approach could end up killing many tens of millions of people through starvation and deprivation and totalitarian takeovers and all the ills that those kinds of governments inflict on their populations. So I think the biggest thing we can do right now, other than just doing our level best to avoid being infected, since we're down this path already, is to make sure that we don't let government collapse all freedoms in our world as a result. So that's kind of my perspective. Some of you may have more medical questions. Like I said, my answers to the medical questions will be just as incorrect as everyone else's because we don't have sufficient data. But I think the political ramifications of this will be quite profound. And it will be interesting to see if we can rapidly recover from this economic collapse. But I have my doubts. So, yes.
I have two questions. And on a personal level, would you recommend that people stay home, not go to work, avoid going out as much as possible, wear a mask in public? What for on a personal level,
Yeah.
what do you recommend?
For all of those things, yes. The risk factors are becoming more clear as we go forward. For most people, the risk, once you get the disease, the risk of dying from it is fairly low. And it's rather capricious in its choice of who dies in the young. And then you always hear the stories of the worst possible case, you know, a 13-year-old that dies. Those are quite rare, but they're always at the top of the news. Most people that need to be really worried about this are elderly, overweight diabetics. And that's where the information seems to be heading, that they're the highest risk. So if you're in that camp, do everything you can to stay out of the public eye and away from any family members that might bring it to you. Because if they go out and they come back home, they're going to infect you. So those people are the ones who are the first to be felled by this kind of disease and this particular virus. So wearing a mask does help if masks are available. And if there aren't masks available, I think the current recommendation is to use a bandana, look like a bank robber. And when everyone looks like a bank robber, I guess we'll have to deal with the consequences.
There's been a lot of talk about certain drugs, and one particularly the most prominent one being hydroxychloroquine, which is a malaria medicine, being successful. Do you have any information, opinion about whether that's going to be an effective treatment for coronavirus?
Well, the medical community has a really hard time endorsing something that has so little data attached to its use. But there appears to be anecdotal evidence that it helps, very small studies that show some benefit. But in a disease that has a 99% survival rate, it's really hard, and it takes a lot of patience in a study to prove that it decreases the death rate or the progression to respiratory failure, which is how people usually die from this. Respiratory failure or congestive heart failure. So hydroxychloroquine, just in general, it's an anti-malarial, but it hasn't been used for malaria very much for a long time. It's used mostly for rheumatic diseases that are of autoimmune nature. So the mechanism of its benefit would be that it prevents your immune system from rising up too much and killing you. But the rheumatologists tell me that they don't know how that could possibly help in 1 week, because when they treat rheumatoid arthritis or anything else with Plaquenil or hydroxychloroquine, it takes months to get the benefit. So they're wondering how it could possibly help soon. But because there are insufficient data and hydroxychloroquine in a short course is not likely to hurt you unless you have a certain cardiac condition called QT prolongation, then go ahead and do it. But make sure your physician gets an EKG first.
A question from Keith again, wondering how Sweden can go its own way and basically not shut down its economy and let the virus run its course. That may not be exactly your bailiwick.
Well, that is my bailiwick, because I'm actually more interested in economics and government policy than in the medical aspects of this. And I think my personal belief is that if you are not infected in the first round, and let's say only 5% of the population is infected because of the lockdown, then 95% are susceptible to round two, and round two will come because as soon as you lock it down, and because of the lie promulgated by the Chinese Communist government that you can eradicate the disease, in round one, because of that lie, the disease will come back and then ravage the 95% again. Do we shut down the economy for 1 year, 5 years? How long does it take? So until you get what we in medicine call herd immunity, which means if the whole herd has already been infected around you, you as a single cattle can't get infected because there's no one around you that's infected to transmit it to you. So until we get herd immunity with an 85% infection prevalence and resistance and then immunity, we're susceptible to round 2, round 3, round 4. And then when those rounds come, if the virus has mutated slightly into a more deadly form, then we're sitting ducks. So Sweden may be correct. They may be the smartest ones around.
Do you have, certainly if you're President Trump and your health care advisors come to you and say, Mr. President, if we don't do anything, we don't take this drastic action, 1 to 2 million Americans or more are going to die from this disease. It's hard to say, well, let's just keep the economy open. Do you have an opinion about what the death toll would be if we follow Sweden's policy and basically let the economy keep going, try to protect those who are most at risk? Don't come up and kiss people on the cheek and so on. Just try to maintain some distance, but not shut down the economy. Do you have any guesstimate about how bad it would be if we did that?
Well, if most people don't behave like Joe Biden and don't go around sniffing people's hair and kissing them on the cheek anyway, but if we behaved even less like Joe Biden and kept to ourselves in public, or maybe less like Bill Clinton, because he was known to do the same kind of a thing, then there would be less infected. But eventually, everyone will be infected. And let's say the death rate is 0.1%, the same as flu. The flu, as you saw the statistics, infects maybe 20, 50 million people and has a 0.1% death rate, so it tends to do the equivalent number of thousands of deaths. So 20 to 50 million results in 20 to 50,000 deaths. And this disease, let's say the South Korean percentage is more accurate, has a 0.5% death rate. And let's say 100% of the population of the United States is infected. Then you would have about 1.5 million deaths. And remember, these are not all people who died from the virus. There are people maybe who just died with the virus, and were destined to die that year anyway, because 3 million Americans plus die every year as it is, and a lot of them from the same diseases that are the risk factors for this infection. So I'd say at the highest it would be 1.5 million if everybody were infected. And everybody likes to say, well, we've got a rich man's ethics. So at any price we save one life. Well, other countries don't have that luxury, and we're going to find out very quickly that the rich man's ethics that says, don't trade money for lives is resulting in no money, and we're no longer a rich country. We will be a poor country. And believe it or not, probably the highest risk of this thing is that the US dollar will no longer be the reserve currency of the world. And all of our fiscal lack of restraint at the federal level will come home to roost as soon as our money is no longer diluted by its international spread. And we will start seeing the economic consequences of fiscal profligacy at the federal level. So I'm actually far more concerned about the economic consequences of this disease than the physical effects. Now, all of that would change if the virus mutates and becomes a much higher percentage killer. If it's like the Great Plague of 1666 in England, where about half the population dies, all bets are off. That's when you start doing this kind of reaction. But I think, and I blame the Chinese, not for necessarily releasing it on the world, because I think that was a mistake, although it was certainly probably the researchers on bats who made that happen, if you look at some of the information that's coming out. But I blame them for the lack of honesty about the success of their strategy. And then we're emulating their strategy and putting the entire world economy at risk. And, it's not just rich people who are going to suffer when this economy tanks. It's going to be everybody. And people, and the least fortunate will be affected the most when the economy collapses. So I'm way more worried about the economy than about the health consequences. And, I'm not trying to be heartless, because most of the people who die from these things are people who were, on the end of life's conveyor belt, as it were, at the time that they're infected anyway. And there are scattered cases of younger people that are very sad, but shouldn't dominate your thinking if you were trying to set worldwide policy on disease containment. So
I had a question that was in my mind, and I have lost track of it for a second here. We have here.
We have another question. Keith has been very prolific in his questions. Thank you, Keith.
Says different opinions and over the years, and none are epidemiologists. Why should healthcare professionals who don't specialize in infectious diseases and their transmission be listened to by us lay people at all?
Well, that's a very good question, and that's why I started out my discussion by saying don't believe anything I say, because I don't have data. But I can give you my speculation and my beliefs. You didn't invite an epidemiologist. You didn't invite an infectious disease specialist to speak on this topic. You invited an internal medicine specialist who just also happens to be a politician, and you don't have to believe anything I say. But and like I said, all the predictions of all the experts go awry if they don't have the right information. And physicians fall into multiple categories beyond just their specialties. They also fall in the categories of those who rely on their intuition, rely on their basic science knowledge to project the future. And there are other people who sit around and wait for the data to come in before they draw any conclusions. And you can, if you listen to them, they would say don't do a thing. All of this is overreaction. We don't have enough data. We shouldn't do anything. And there are others who say, well, based on our knowledge of cell biology, we should do this or that or the other thing. And right now, the ones that are speaking up are the ones who say do something based on a guess. So it's all guesswork. So you don't have to believe anything I or anybody else says, because even the specialists in infectious disease don't have enough information. They don't know what to do. And I speak to them all the time.
Do you have any sense of your view, the views of your other physicians at Loma Linda? Do they generally share your view? Do you have any sense of the division between, take some precautions but don't close down the economy versus this is really serious and it deserves to close down the economy?
Well, by and large, physicians don't have any interest in or knowledge of economic principles. So if you talk to your average physician, they're going to concentrate on the medical aspects of this. And they're going to try to be very pragmatic. They're going to try to listen to the consensus opinions of experts. And they're not going to opine on the economic consequences of this kind of a disease. I happen to be, in many respects, more interested in economics and politics than even in medicine, even though that's my career is medicine. So I'm a bit of an outlier, and I tend to be more extroverted in my opinions than some physicians are, and most would not give any opinion on this topic at all. They would just say, well, let's follow what Anthony Fauci says. And I think Fauci is probably the most credible person in the United States as a spokesman on this topic, and I would listen to him over a lot of other people. But local physicians really don't get into that as much as I have. So, if you think what I've done is going overboard, then I'm guilty. I'm guilty as charged.
Mark asks, are the Chinese wet markets where they sell live animals for consumption a risk to health and the rest of the world?
Well, very definitely. There was an article that came out earlier this week that I thought was fascinating, which said that this virus is commonly isolated in a particular species of bat that lives, 500 miles away from Wuhan, China. But the researchers at their little virology lab in Wuhan were doing research on those bats and harvesting their viruses and researching them. And that lab was very close to the wet market that everybody's accusing of releasing the virus. So did it come from people eating those bats? Did it come from people researching those bats? I don't know, but nobody's doing that anywhere else except in Wuhan.
Another question comes in from Anita that asks about the effect of the modeling by the World Health Organization in triggering this big panic.
Mm-hmm. The modeling, could they be more specific?
I think she may be referring to when the director of WHO came out and said that it was going to have a 3.4% death rate. And that seemed to kind of be the trigger for the panic.
Yeah, well, the WHO is acting like everyone else on insufficient information. And the death rate is 3.4% if you undercount the number of people who are infected. So you can look at the statistics and you can tell where the testing is less frequently done, and it's the places that have the higher death rates. And that's because the deaths divided by the infecteds is inflated because the number of infecteds is very much underestimated. So if you underestimate the number of people infected by 90%, then your death rate is 10 times higher than the reality, because your denominator in your calculation is 1/10 the size. So it's just simple arithmetic.
How long does the virus live on clothing, packages, and other surfaces?
It depends on so many factors like temperature. This virus is reported to be heat sensitive. So if something is hot, it doesn't last as long as if it's cool. It is affected by humidity. It's affected by so many different things that it's almost impossible to know. But if you just think of all the other viruses you've been infected by, you could have got them from droplet transmission and inhalation. You could have got them from picking them up on handles and rubbing them into your nose and mouth and eyes, which we tend to do all the time. Or you could have just got them from inanimate objects all around you. There's no way to know. We don't know. And the numbers that come out are all over the place. So there's some of them it lasts for up to 17 days. And I don't even know what it is about day 17 that's any worse than day 16. So maybe the virus will hang around for 50 years. I don't know. Nobody knows for sure. But the amount that it takes to infect you seems to decrease with all prior viral infections in the history of the world. There's no ongoing virus that's just hanging around all over the place, constantly there, absent, the big killers of the past like smallpox and on the bacterial front, tuberculosis, for example. If you want to be perfectly safe from this virus, you basically have to go into complete lockdown for the rest of your life, and it's not warranted.
Keith asks that to what extent is the healthcare people in the healthcare industry just not caring about economics because they tilt left politically?
Well, I don't think it's so much as a political tilt as it is just people have expertise in one field, and they don't tend to think in terms of all the fields of knowledge simultaneously. I tend to be a little bit more eclectic than your average physician in my knowledge. Most physicians will just stick to the topic that they know best. I'm foolish enough to opine on things that I don't know best, and other people will say, well, I don't know anything about economics. And I don't think it's so much left or right as it is that when circumstances arise that invite authoritarian response, leftists take the opportunity. They never let a crisis go to waste. So if you want to use Rahm Emanuel as your leader, he wouldn't let this crisis go to waste. And what a perfect opportunity to just take over everyone's lives. And so it's not so much that the disease was brought on by authoritarians. In this case, it happened to be, I think, exacerbated by misinformation from authoritarians. And the future will tell to what extent they succeed in winning when they can't win during normal times. But they have a much higher percentage chance of winning when a crisis is upon us. And here we are. And when economics go awry and people start starving, guess what? Left-wing people become very popular, and we have to fight that.
I can just ask, what are you doing to protect yourself at work at the hospital?
I'm doing the same thing everyone else is. The hospital gives me a mask when I go in, and they ask me questions about symptoms when I go through the front doors, and nothing more than that. I'm not personally involved in direct patient care of the hospitalized patients, so I don't know exactly what they're doing up on the wards, but I imagine they're using a little bit more of the PPE, personal protective equipment. But as far as what I'm doing, I'm just down on the administrative floor, so what I have to fear is my fellow healthcare workers, not so much the patients.
You touched on it, and I hope this will be the concluding question here, is there's a cost of economic depression that is not just in lost lives, lost businesses, and lost wealth. There's a cost in health and lives.
Yeah, oh, definitely. The cause of freedom is advanced by all the freedoms that we enjoy. It's economic freedom, it's economic success. And don't let anybody ever convince you that socialism improves the plight of the poor. It just rearranges the deck chairs on the economic Titanic and gives everybody a false sense of success because no one else is succeeding any better than they are. But the economic cost of this, imagine that we had the economy of the Dark Ages with 10 to 20 times the population. Do you really think we can feed 7.5 billion people with the economy of the Middle Ages? And remember, that's the goal of true leftists. Their goal is to have the economy collapse so that mankind has no possibility of destroying nature. So the global warming people are just delighted by this because look, nobody's using fuel, nobody's doing anything. If half of mankind died, they would be very happy in their success at protecting the environment. So the causes of authoritarianism, the causes of collectivism, and I just repeated myself, collectivism and authoritarianism are one and the same. The causes are advanced by anything that reduces your freedom. Anything that causes economic collapse gives them more power. So they may not have engineered this. They're probably not smart enough to have engineered this. But they are smart enough to take advantage of it. And that's where we have to be diligent as Tea Party patriots, as human patriots, to prevent another round of authoritarian regimes in this world. You know, even before this virus came, a lot of people in this country were contemplating voting for a socialist. And I would remind them, we fought a world war, a Cold War, and regional wars to keep people like Bernie Sanders from running other countries. Why would we put him in charge of ours? You know, that was before the virus. And now that the virus is coming, who knows? Maybe someone just like him will end up being in charge of our country. And if our country collapses economically, our advantages and our defenses against that collapse, and we will be defenseless. So, to me, that's the biggest risk. I think in the big picture, I don't just think about the medical aspects of it. It's the economics and the politics that have the biggest risk to our lives going forward.
Do you have any cases at Loma Linda University Medical Center?
Well, the number of cases are in the range of a dozen or so. I haven't received any updates in the last couple of days, but we are just at the beginning of the Inland Empire's participation in this epidemic. We're just at the beginning. So at Loma Linda, there's minimal cases, but the biggest risk to our local medical community is not the disease itself. The biggest risk is that because we shut down commerce, we also shut down the revenue streams to hospitals and physicians. So the hospitals nationwide, except for Kaiser, which has a very special guaranteed income stream, all of the fee-for-service medical facilities are in economic collapse as we speak. And absent a bailout from the federal government, a lot of them would go bankrupt. So that, to me, is the biggest risk to our future and to our health. And the disease itself, thank goodness, has a less than 1% death rate. So we can be thankful for that. And like I said before, this is a dress rehearsal for the big one. But what I'm afraid of is we may have overreacted so much to this small death risk that we will not have the wherewithal to battle the big one at all. So that's what scares me.
I have one Loma Linda question.
Yes.
The three incumbents that ran, you, John Leonard, and Ovi Popescu, ran as a team.
Yes.
Your signs were the same, your literature was the same, you ran as a team.
Yeah.
Basically saying, things are pretty good here in Loma Linda, you should re-elect us.
Yes.
The voters chose to re-elect two of you, but not Ovi. And I've puzzled as to what the thinking was among voters that says, we're pretty happy with the guys in the incumbents, but let's bring in the socialist.
Well, I can tell you exactly why that happened. There are people who are anti-incumbent, and two of us made the mistake of putting incumbent as our description on the ballot. I should have put physician. Ovi should have put occupational therapist. That would have helped. But the biggest reason why Ovi lost in Loma Linda is because the ballot design is so defective that fully half of the citizens of Loma Linda who voted did not realize they had 3 votes. Half of them. Because the ballot says in very small letters in the upper right, way off to the side, where the names to vote for are here, way off to the side, was this little thing. It says, vote for no more than 3. So half the people who voted for 1. And guess what? Of the 3 incumbents, Ovi was last. If I had been last, I would have lost. I fully believe that. If John Leonard had been last, he would have lost. I fully believe that. Because people who wanted to vote for an incumbent picked the first one or the second one and not the third one. So it's sad to say that our electoral system is so defective that something like that could determine the outcome of an election. And I will be speaking to the registrar of voters to have that corrected going forward. But if you look at every election that had just a single choice, there was about a 5% undervote. That means 5% of the people did not elect to vote in that election. So 95% cast a vote in that election of the people who cast a ballot. In our election and in the Republican and Democrat Central Committee elections, where there were multiple votes that you could cast, fully half in both of those voted just for 1. And in our election, you could vote for 3. And if you only vote for 1, that robs our slate of 3 of 2/3 of the votes for our slate by half of the people. So we lost 1/3 of our vote. And in the Republican Central Committee and the Democrat Central Committee elections, half the people voted for 1, though they could vote for 6. Now you can't convince me that there was one Republican Central Committee candidate that person believed in and wanted everyone else to lose. No, they had, the undervote was 50%. And it's 5% in all the other elections. So that was everything. And once that distortion is accounted for, there's no telling how the election would have turned out.
Well, thank you very much, Dusty, for your insights and your opinions, and certainly better informed than most of the people we hear talking on TV, and certainly a very vital issue because there are huge costs of economic depression and potentially large costs of loss of lives if a disease does turn out to be more fatal than maybe we're guessing, and also the extreme. No one has enough information to make good decisions at this point.
Yeah, true. And if a worse version of it comes out, those of us who sheltered and didn't get infected the first time are sitting ducks for round 2. So don't count your blessings until this whole thing is over.